American tanks were not destroyed because they were outgunned. They were destroyed because they followed the rules. On paper, the rules made sense. Move forward, stay in line, get close and fight. In reality, every step brought them closer to a gun that could kill from far away, while they had to crawl forward just to have a chance. Here is the contradiction. The tank that kept losing was built to move fast and attack from many directions, but it was forced to fight straight ahead. Like a machine it was never meant to be. Nothing changed on the battlefield that day. The steel stayed the same. The guns stayed the same. Only one thing changed. Someone realized that the enemy's strength only worked if you played by its rules. And that raises a disturbing question. How many men died before anyone stopped following the manual begins with an uncomfortable truth. The problem was not the Sherman. The problem was the idea of how the Sherman was supposed to be used. American armored doctrine was built long before Shermans met Tigers in Normandy. It was written for mobility, reliability, and mass production. On training grounds and in manuals, tanks were tools of momentum. They advanced together. They supported infantry. They suppressed positions. They were not meant to hunt heavy armor in duels. That job, in theory, belonged to tank destroyers and artillery. But war rarely follows theory. When American units encountered German heavy tanks in the hedgerows of France, doctrine did not adapt fast enough. Instead of changing the problem, commanders applied the same solution harder. Advance in formation. Close the distance. Concentrate fire. If one tank could not penetrate, 5 might. If 5 failed, 10 would be sent forward. This logic made sense on a chalkboard. It failed in open fields and narrow lanes. The Tiger thrived on predictability, long sight lines, limited approaches, one direction of threat at a time. American doctrine gave it exactly that. By advancing head-on, Shermans entered the fight already inside the Tiger's optimal conditions. The result was not combat, it was execution. Here is the deeper flaw. Doctrine treated tanks as interchangeable pieces. Lose one, replace it with another. But tanks were not abstract units. Each Sherman carried 5 men. Each advance by the book converted industrial efficiency into human loss. Quantity over quality was supposed to be an advantage. In practice, it became an excuse not to think. This is why defeats repeated themselves. Not because crews lacked courage, not because machines lacked capability, but because the system refused to question its own assumptions. When losses occurred, they were explained away as the cost of war, not as evidence of a broken approach. And so the battlefield filled with the same pattern, same formations, same routes, same outcomes. The Tiger did not need to adapt. Doctrine did that work for it. By this point, the imbalance was no longer technological. It was intellectual. One side was allowed to rethink how it fought. The other was ordered not to. And that is when the real danger appeared. Because once a system confuses obedience with effectiveness, it begins producing casualties faster than solutions. The stage was set for a change, not in hardware, not in firepower, but in how the problem itself was defined. Instead of asking how to make the Sherman stronger, the question became how to stop fighting the Tiger on its terms. This shift sounds simple, but it was radical. For years, every solution had focused on material answers. Bigger guns, thicker armor, new vehicles. All of them expensive, all of them slow to arrive. None of them helped the crews already on the battlefield. The alternative was not technological, it was conceptual. The Tiger dominated because it controlled the engagement. It chose when to fire, where to fire, and which target to destroy first. Its long-range gun and heavy armor only mattered because it faced one threat at a time. One direction, one decision. Once that control was identified, a different logic emerged. What if the goal was not to penetrate the Tiger's strongest armor, but to overload its decision-making? What if the objective was not to win a duel, but to deny the Tiger the ability to choose? This is where the geometry changed. The Sherman did not need to be stronger. It needed to be multiple. Not in numbers sent forward blindly, but in angles applied simultaneously. Space became a weapon. Time became a constraint. Movement replaced firepower as the critical variable. Heavy tanks are powerful, but they are also slow to reorient. Turret rotation takes time. Hull movement takes even longer. Every second spent turning toward one threat is a second of vulnerability to another. This was not a trick. It was a physical limit. When multiple Shermans approached from different directions at the same time, the Tiger faced a problem it could not solve with armor or range. No matter where it turned, something else was left exposed. For the first time, the Tiger reacted instead of dictated. That distinction mattered. The battlefield stopped being a firing range and became a timing problem. Arrive too early, and you die alone. Arrive too late, and your ally is already burning. Precision replaced bravery. Coordination replaced doctrine. This approach did not require new equipment. It required something far rarer in war: permission to abandon the script. And once that permission existed, even briefly, the results changed. Not because the Tiger was suddenly weak, but because its strength depended on a single condition: isolation of its enemies. Remove that condition, and the imbalance collapsed. This was the moment when the war between machines quietly became a war between ideas. And ideas, unlike steel, could spread fast. Is where theory collides with reality. The moment multiple Shermans move at once, the battlefield compresses. Distances shrink. Seconds begin to matter more than firepower. What was once a long-range duel becomes a race against rotation speed, visibility, and reaction time. A heavy tank like the Tiger is devastating when it dictates the pace, but when threats appear from more than one direction, its advantages turn inward. The gun can only point one way. The optics can only focus on one target. The turret can only rotate so fast. These are not tactical opinions. They are mechanical facts. As one Sherman advances to draw attention, the Tiger responds exactly as designed. It turns. It tracks. It commits. And in that commitment, it exposes itself elsewhere. This is the critical moment. The Tiger must choose, and choosing is failure. If it turns toward the nearest threat, it reveals its side. If it pivots the hull, it loses time. If it waits, it loses initiative. Every option carries a cost, and none of those costs existed when the fight was one-directional. The Sherman crews do not need perfect shots. They need overlap, pressure, continuity. One tank forces rotation, another forces delay. A third arrives inside the window created by both. This is why timing replaces courage. Being early means isolation. Being late means absence. Only synchronization works. The engagement no longer belongs to the tank with the biggest gun. It belongs to the side that controls sequence. Who appears first? Who appears second? Who denies recovery? At this point, the Tiger is no longer hunting. It is being managed. Smoke, movement, and spacing begin to matter more than armor thickness. The battlefield becomes crowded, confusing, and loud. The Tiger's greatest advantage, clarity at distance, disappears. Its crew reacts instead of plans. This is when outcomes change. Not instantly, not cleanly, but decisively. Because once a heavy tank loses control of the engagement, it becomes what it was never meant to be: a large target forced to respond faster than its design allows. And that is the moment when superiority collapses, not because the machine failed, but because the situation no longer suited it. Once the outcome changes in one engagement, it creates a problem for the entire system. Because a tactic that works once can be dismissed as luck. A tactic that works repeatedly becomes evidence. And evidence is dangerous to doctrine. The moment heavy tanks could be neutralized without superior firepower, the logic holding the old approach together began to crack. If mobility, timing, and coordination could defeat armor, then losses were no longer unavoidable. They were preventable. This realization spread quietly at first. Crews adjusted spacing. Units stopped advancing in perfect lines. Movement became less predictable. Engagements became shorter. Survival rates changed before manuals did. That gap mattered. War does not wait for doctrine to catch up. It punishes delay. Every day a broken idea remains in place. It converts obedience into casualties. Every day a better approach stays unofficial. It exists only where individuals are willing to risk punishment for adaptation. Here is the deeper consequence. Once a system admits that its rules are wrong, it must also admit that past losses were not fate. They were decisions. And institutions resist that admission harder than they resist the enemy. But pressure accumulates. Reports change tone. Commanders notice patterns. Encounters once described as acceptable losses begin to look avoidable. What began as an adjustment in behavior becomes a challenge to authority, and slowly, the logic flips. Instead of asking crews to survive bad doctrine, doctrine begins to chase successful crews. What was once improvised becomes encouraged. What was once unofficial becomes teachable. The battlefield rewrites the classroom. This is how change actually happens in war. Not through announcements, not through speeches, but through repetition that cannot be ignored. By the time new weapons arrive, the shift is already underway. The technology does not create the change, it formalizes it, and that leaves a final, uncomfortable insight. The most dangerous period in any war is not when the enemy has better machines. It is when your own system refuses to learn faster than people are dying. Begins with a reversal. By the end of the war, the Tiger was no longer a mystery. Its armor had limits. Its gun had counters. Its dominance was conditional. What once looked unstoppable turned out to depend on one fragile assumption, that its enemies would behave predictably. And predictability was not a technical flaw. It was a human one. The real lesson of this story is not about tanks. It is about systems that mistake rules for intelligence. Doctrine exists to simplify chaos. But when doctrine stops evolving, it does something far more dangerous. It turns thinking into disobedience. In this case, men died not because the enemy was unbeatable, but because adaptation was slower than reality. The machines did not change. The physics did not change. Only the willingness to question instructions did. This is why superior weapons do not guarantee victory. They only guarantee advantage as long as the opponent accepts the frame of the fight. The moment that frame collapses, power becomes inertia. History repeats this pattern again and again, not just in war, but anywhere rigid systems meet complex environments. The greatest failures rarely come from ignorance. They come from certainty. The Tiger was feared because it represented technical perfection. The Sherman survived because it eventually represented flexibility. And flexibility, once learned, spreads faster than steel ever could. So when we ask why one side lost men faster than the other, the answer is uncomfortable. It was not because they lacked courage. It was not because they lacked machines. It was because, for too long, they trusted a rulebook more than reality. And that leaves one final question. In any system built to survive conflict, what matters more? Having the best tools, or knowing when the rules that govern them no longer make sense?